remember. Okay, so hello everybody and welcome to the second All Souls seminar of the year. Before I introduce our speaker for today, can I just remind us all to keep our sound off while Penny's speaking, and if some of you have your cameras on, that's helpful so she can see that she's not just speaking into the void. And I'm oops. So just, yeah, people make sure that they've got their sound off, please. Yeah, and I'm recording it. So as normal, I will record the talk and then we won't record the question and answers. So today we're very fortunate to have Professor Penny Green come to speak to us about her work. Penny is Professor of Law and Globalization and Head of the Law School at Queen Mary, University of London. In addition to that, Penny is the founder and director of the award-winning International State Crime Initiative, which is a multidisciplinary international initiative committed to researching, analysing and disseminating research-based knowledge about criminal state practices and resistance to them. Today, Penny's going to be talking to us about state crime and civil activism, drawing on work that she did with her colleague Tony Ward over 5 years with a variety of non-governmental organizations across the world. So Penny, I'm going to mute myself and hand over to you. I understand Penny will talk for about 45 minutes and then we'll have about half an hour or so for questions.
Great, thanks so much, Mary, and to Angela, who was involved in organising this. It's really lovely to be here. I'm not doing any slides today, and it's a shame because I've got some really nice images, but it would technically be too confusing, I think, for me and messy. So I'm going to concentrate on the talk itself, and you can imagine, perhaps. But I wanted to start by saying that the work that Tony and I did is published in this particular volume. And it did take a very long time, more than 5 years, in fact. It was more like 8. And it's all about civil society resistance to state violence and corruption. So I think this afternoon I want to articulate a way of thinking criminologically about the state, in which the concept of civil society plays a crucial role, a much more crucial role, for example, than law. My talk, while drawing primarily on this large-scale empirical study, is framed by 2 main arguments, which Tony Ward and I have been developing over a number of years, and some of you may be familiar with them. The first is that state crime, rather than a legal construct defined and punished by domestic and international laws and courts, is actually better understood as a violation of social norms, which may or may not reflect legal norms. And that following from this, organised civil society, we think, affords the most promising and effective means of challenging state violence and corruption, though of course it's not without its problems. So first I'll say something about these 2 arguments because they run counter to criminological orthodoxy before moving on to describe the study that the paper's based on, and some of the more interesting or challenging findings which have emerged. So, state crime. Legal definitions of crime are inadequate in understanding and identifying crimes committed by states and their proxies, not least because states make laws and they are notoriously unwilling to define their own practice as criminal. In fact, one Burmese human rights activist told me, and I'm quoting, under a repressive regime like Burma, state crime is the rule of law. Now, he was speaking of a period during the 80s, 90s and early 2000s, but of course that now is again the case in Burma following the coup in February. He certainly recognized the existence of international law, but his question to me was, well, where is the enforcement? Where is the value of international law? And in a context such as the Burmese dictatorship, international law may provide a useful discursive resource for activists, but the recognition that what the state proclaims as legality is in reality state crime, and some of what it defines as crime is in reality resistance to state crime. These are essentially a matter of moral and political consciousness. And for me, that consciousness is most visibly and powerfully represented in organized form by civil society. The definition that Tony Ward and I developed attempts to address these inadequacies by focusing on human rights violations carried out by state agents in pursuit of state organizational goals. In other words, illegitimate violence and corruption. And I think this definition also has the capacity to capture state crime as a process rather than simply an event. Now, the boundaries between illegitimate and legitimate violence and legitimate and illegitimate financial dealings are not, of course, always clear. And it's in drawing and contesting those boundaries, I think, that civil society plays one of its most important roles. Given that agents of the state, the intelligence services, prison authorities, police, military and security forces, government officials and their proxies, given that they are so frequently responsible for criminal acts, it seems to us to make little sense to imagine that we might look to those agencies for solutions. For the critical scholar of crimes of the powerful, the solutions to state crime lie actually well outside the frameworks of criminal justice law, international conventions, domestic or international courts. Instead, any such solutions are much more likely to be found in the struggles of the state's victims or with those who advocate and organize on their behalf. And it's the organization of those victims and advocates that not only has the power to challenge state violence and corruption, but is central in defining that corruption and violence as criminal in the first instance. So what do I mean by civil society? Well, the definition we adopt is broadly consistent with what political theorists and sociologists usually mean by it. That is, we're concerned with associations that are not part of the state or of organized political society, for example, political parties, but which are engaged in some way in seeking to influence, monitor, or resist state crime. The term civil society is broad enough to cover international NGOs like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, and local grassroots organizations, media outlets independent of the state, and religious bodies, for example. We've chosen civil society as our subject of resistance, recognizing that indeed, there are other forms, other mediums through which struggles against state criminality are expressed: guerrilla movements, armed resistance, political wings of insurgent groups, individual activism, and so on. The primary reason for favouring civil society is its generally accepted and widespread legitimacy as an authoritative check on the power and actions of the state. And if we're looking to a force capable of challenging state criminality, then that force, flawed as we demonstrate it sometimes is all the more conceptually and practically valuable if it carries legitimacy in the society in which it operates. So we identify three roles of civil society in relation to state crime. Firstly, civil society is engaged in naming forms of criminal behaviour. That is, whether or not some word equivalent to crime is actually used, identifying certain forms of behaviour as seriously harmful, wrong, and needing to be stopped. Secondly, civil society makes instances of this behaviour publicly visible. And this is a complex process. It involves the gathering of information, deciding which information to believe and endorse, disseminating it in a credible form. In the case of repressive, secretive regimes, both the naming of state crime and the dissemination of information about it will often involve some kind of what Rissa et al. Call the Boomerang Effect, in which the information is first transmitted to civil society organizations outside the relevant state and then flies back in the form of international pressure and adverse publicity for the offending government. The third role of civil society is that of putting pressure on the perpetrators of crime to cease their activities and/or to make amends by some form of acknowledgement, apology, or reparation. So that's essentially the framework within which we conducted the research. The study was funded by the ESRC. We got around £850,000. And it involved 5 years of intensive research exploring civil society resistance to state corruption and state violence in 6 states with histories of high levels of repression and state criminality. So we conducted ethnographic field work in Turkey, Tunisia, Burma, Myanmar, Colombia, Kenya, and Papua New Guinea. And we looked at 50 different civil society organizations and conducted interviews with around 400 civil society activists. Because our data set is so huge, I'm not going to talk about everything, of course, but I'm going to focus on 3 of the countries, Turkey, Tunisia, and Burma. And each of the countries at the time that we conducted the research represented a state in transition from conflict and authoritarian rule, however fragile the cases of Turkey and Burma now appear to be. Burma, during decades of isolation and military dictatorship, experienced a particularly brutal destruction of civil society, and as in Tunisia, the imposition of regime-controlled civil society organizations. A little bit more about that later. During the period of our research, Burma witnessed a newly concerted attempt to rebuild civil society in the aftermath of decades of repressive rule, while at the same time involved in civil war and genocide. After 15 years of devastating conflict in southeastern Turkey, civil society was at last, at that time, demonstrating signs of revival under a democratic regime when we began our work. Though from 2015 onwards, that same civil society has come under very fierce attack. Field work took us to remote and sometimes hostile regions, the phosphate mining area of Tunisia, which borders Algeria, Burma's Kachin state, in which a civil war has been raging for over 6 decades, Rakhine state, where the Burmese Rohingya minority faced genocide at the time. That genocide has effectively been completed. And to southeast Turkey and its border with Iraq, where sporadic violence between the Turkish state and Kurdish insurgents continued all the while during our research. We were not in this study explicitly studying the perpetrators of state crime, but some of the organizations we studied, particularly in Burma, could certainly be considered as accomplices to some forms of state crime, and in this case, notably the genocide against the Rohingya, despite being courageous opponents of the state in other respects, and that's something we might want to talk about in the discussion. And of course, we learned a great deal about state criminality through learning of the motivations and influences which led to the formation and work of the organizations we studied. More generally, however, the institutional memory of state crime that exists within CSOs is a very rich knowledge base for researchers. The organizations we investigated were not always explicitly concerned with human rights. Some oriented their initial work around religious expression or charitable endeavors and cultural freedoms. Some of the groups were urban, some were based in rural locations. A number had countrywide reach, while others operated within a narrow local context. All organizations, however, had emerged or changed character as a result of repressive state conduct, and they developed their work around state responses to their very existence. There's an enormous literature on civil society, resistance and social movements, much of it theoretical, and it's not my intention to revisit that literature here, but rather to offer a glimpse into the nature and practice of civil society resistance as it's lived, through the testimony of those who fashioned it in environments which were far from conducive to free civil expression. Our focus was on that courageous element of civil society that sought to challenge the violence and corruption of their states. Because much of our earlier work had identified the role of civil society as directly involved in identifying, naming, exposing, and challenging state crime, we were concerned in this project to understand how this was done under conditions of repressive state control, which often rendered the existence of these organizations illegal. In particular, we set out to understand the motivations and ethos which underpinned their work and the strategies they deployed to achieve their goals, how they understood the boundaries of legitimate state action, how they regarded and used law, religion, culture, and ethics in framing their normative understandings, and what approach they adopted to violence. Human rights law was only one among many sets of norms against which state practices were measured. And while many of the organizations we studied talked of international law and international courts, it was largely at the rhetorical level. Even organizations committed to taking cases of human rights violations to, for example, the European Court of Human Rights, did not draw their normative frameworks from law. Akın Birdal is a good example of this. He was one of the leaders of civil society activism in Turkey and survived an attempt on his life by the state in 1998. And he said, legality is not important when it comes to human rights. What is important is legitimacy. A Karen human rights group activist similarly said, our perspective is absolutely rooted in villagers' own perspectives of the situation in their areas. So it doesn't use international human rights norms to define human rights abuses in the region. It's according to what they themselves consider to be the problems that they face. Other normative sources we identified in our interviews included national constitutions, socialist ideals, charitable, religious, and spiritual values, and local traditions, including customary practices. Our data set is vast, and there's much I won't have time to talk about. So for the remainder of my talk, I'll focus on 5 areas: civil society under conditions of repression, ethnicity and religion, charity and politics, this dialectic between repression and resistance, and attitudes and accommodations to violence. So let's look at civil society under repressive regimes. I'll say a little about the regimes themselves to provide some background for the civil organizations which emerged. What's clear from our research is that the nature of a political regime conditions the form of opposition that arises against it. And regardless of the degree of repression exercised by that regime, civil resistance finds some form of expression, always. While conditions in Burma, Turkey, and Tunisia were significantly different, all share recent histories of state terror, endemic torture, impunity, and political violence. The regimes in Burma and Tunisia adopted similar bifurcated strategies to deter popular unrest. A fiercely repressive state apparatus combined with attempts to generate and impose a regime-friendly, sanitized and incorporated form of civil society which could be controlled by the state. Burma, from 1962, was a politically and economically closed society ruled by a very oppressive military regime. All forms of opposition were brutally repressed, minorities persecuted, and a climate of fear pervaded all levels of Burmese society. Through heavy-handed forms of co-option and direct coercion, the regime formed peasants and workers' councils to ensure that citizens were organized in a manner which could be controlled and manipulated by the regime for their own ends. A significant development in this direction was the State Law and Order Restoration Council. That was the name of the Burmese regime. It's the best acronym I know of, SLORC. SLORC's cultivation of a wholly state-sponsored form of civil society, what would come to be known satirically as gongos, that is, government-organized, non-governmental organizations. Advocacy groups were non-existent, except for those directly mobilized by the state or those underground or operating in the jungle. Dissent was effectively publicly eliminated, or so it appeared to many commentators. But our research revealed evidence of clandestine organizations emerging, particularly after the massacres of thousands of protesters in 1988, and again following the crushing of the 2007 Saffron Revolution. Students and monks were at the vanguard of this civil awakening. One of the leaders, Minko Nai, and fellow student activists built what they called a civil underground and kept alive opposition to the regime all through this period. This underground movement involved university book clubs, study groups at, for example, the American Center in Rangoon. It organized clandestine debates. Students and intellectuals were meeting in tea shops, making plans, writing articles and political pamphlets, intent in some way on energizing and keeping alive civil society. There was no official hierarchy, and those involved had no idea of the numbers, of their numbers, but they did identify themselves as the 88 generation, because the uprising, which was really brutally repressed, took place on the 8th of August 1988. And when the families of political prisoners were visited by the 88 generation, they wore white shirts to as if in sort of in some senses a white wave, the White Campaign it was called. Persistent fear of arrest, imprisonment, torture and death were ever present for these activists. And all organizational activities remained covert. There were spies everywhere. That's our informants in revealed a great deal about how dangerous operating at this time was. There were student spies in particular, and the state offered really incentives for students to become spies, because those who stood up and became informants for the state received support for their families and other favors from the regime. But it's been the persistence of civil society through the darkest moments of Burmese politics that created the space for the groups that we studied to openly organize and to continue to challenge the violations of the Burmese state as soon as there was an opportunity. In Tunisia, Ben Ali's widely acknowledged police state employed a human rights lexicon to portray a Tunisian civil society imbued with normative liberal commitments. The regime introduced legislation and political structures modeled on French laïcism, designed to institutionalize secularism and gender equality. But a long historical interplay of despotism and economic patronage ensured the ideological subservience of citizens to the state. And despite the existence of apparently 9,000 civil society organizations, only a handful were actually independent of the regime. But as in Burma, despite the regime's severe repression and persecution of oppositional political culture and practicing Islam, Tunisian civil society did pave the way for the Arab Spring in 2011. Turkey is, by contrast, a formerly democratic state, was at that time, compared to Tunisia, for example, and Burma, in a multi-party country, but with a very turbulent history of political instability, state repression and violence. Military coups in 1960, 1971, 1980, a postmodern coup in 1997, and an attempted coup in 2016 have all served to foster a robust but periodically threatened human rights community. Key to understanding the development of civil society in Turkey is the Turkish state's war against its Kurdish population in the southeast of the country, beginning in 1984, with periods of peace between 1999 and 2004, and a promising peace process initiated in 2013, which was actually shattered 2 years later in 2015. The majority of civil society organizations we interviewed emerged either directly or indirectly as a result of the state's repression of the Kurds. And whilst they were able to organize, they faced many obstacles and very real dangers from the Turkish state. I want to say something briefly about resistance in exile, and this really only applies to one country. While a number of Tunisian Islamists lived in exile during Ben Ali's rule, and many thousands of Kurds sought asylum outside Turkey. The more open character of these regimes did not result in a strong exiled movement of the kind that emerged out of Burma. Because activism of any kind was so deadly inside Burma, politically motivated Burmese civil society operated largely in exile on the Thai border and in the towns of Mae Sot and Chiang Mai, and I suppose to a lesser extent in London, Oslo, and New York. According to one of our interviewees, following the slaughter of protesters in 1988, many young activists sought political and organizational refuge on the border. One informant told us that people started thinking that on the border there will be groups or organizations or other ethnic minorities who've been fighting against the government for many years. So there may be an opportunity to organize and to get support from there. So young people really did flock to the border. And from around 1996 onwards, rights groups began to spring up there. And they formed a bridge, if you like, between Burma and the international community. Human rights documenters were trained in secret in Thailand and sent back into Burma, where they would quietly collect evidence on torture, rape, the recruitment of child soldiers, state violence, and so on. This information was then transferred back to the border, where it was verified and corroborated. And once it had been through those processes, it was then passed on to international organizations such as Amnesty International. Burma VJ, Burma Video Journalism, was an underground loose organization, a collection of citizen journalists who risked imprisonment, torture, and death to supply video footage of state violence to the exiled Democratic Voice of Burma to use on its channel broadcast into Burma from Norway. So footage of state violence would be made on microcassettes that were smuggled in hollowed out books to the Thai border or via satellite uplink. And they would, that information on the microchips, or not microchips, microcassettes at that time, that information could then be relayed around the world and back into Burma. So that's just something that was very interesting to us about the idea of the resistance in exile. I want to say something now about ethnicity and religion as targets for these repressive regimes. Authoritarian regimes historically seek to build monolithic states with no tolerance for minority rights or minority mechanisms of self-governance. And that was true of all three countries that I'm talking about, where targets of repression were religious and ethnic minorities much of the time. The Burmese regime's commitment to a Burma, the Burma are the majority ethnic group inside, the vast majority of people inside Burma are Burma. But the regime's commitment to a Burma Buddhist state pitched it against the demands of ethnic and Christian and Muslim groups that predominantly live on the border areas inside Burma. In Turkey, particularly during the terror years of the 80s and 90s, about which our respondents were speaking, it was the Kurds, along with the left more generally, who were constructed as the greatest threat to the integrity and unity of the Turkish Republic. By the mid-1990s, more than 3,000 Kurdish villages had been destroyed, and maybe 378,000 villagers had been forcibly displaced and left homeless. One Istanbul activist captured the significance of the Kurdish question when he told us, and I'm quoting, "Discrimination against the Kurds. This was on our agenda from the beginning, but we focused on it more after taking back our rights that were removed under the 12th of September 1980 coup." I mean, if the 12th of September violated us once as Turks, it did it twice to the Kurds. If there were 5 tortures in Mamak prison, there were 100 in Diyarbakir prison. In Tunisia, the fault lines were drawn not between a dominant ethnic and religious elite and those in the minority, but rather between the secular elite on one side and a combination of the organized left and workers' movement and the Islamic poor on the other. Under Ben Ali, Islamists came to be defined by the state as its most potent enemy. The early 1990s saw a period of systematic repression, and an estimated 35,000 men and up to 1,500 women were arbitrarily detained, many of whom were Islamist. The experience of one religiously devout former prisoner was typical. He said, "I wasn't a leader as such, but I led Friday prayers and taught reading circles in our mosque. And this was adequate reason for the regime to imprison him for 12 years. Now I'm just going to say something briefly about this idea of the dialectic of resistance. And I'll start with a quote from Sevla Arjan, who was a member and is a member of the Turkish Human Rights Foundation, and also a member of the Saturday Mothers group who campaign against disappearances. She said, "You are always in tactic wars with the state. Of course, then they also use different tactics against you." I did talk earlier about a dialectical process between repression, resistance, and counter-resistance. And almost without exception, the men and women we interviewed had experienced arrest, detention, exile, long prison sentences, solitary confinement, prolonged torture, the murder or disappearances of friends or family members, harassment, and other forms of state terror. In Tunisia, repressive laws against freedom of association meant that the majority of active or would-be civil society organizations were criminalized. Organizations that sought to challenge state practices were very often prohibited from meeting, holding public events, or seeking funds, and their activities were under constant state surveillance and threat of criminalization. In Turkey, those threats came from the security forces. Offices of these organizations were regularly raided, project funds blocked by the Ministry of the Interior, phones were always tapped, there were targeted assassinations, kidnappings, and disappearances of civil society leaders, lengthy and violent periods of imprisonment, constant surveillance, and brutal torture. Offices of the most prominent human rights organizations were forced to shut for many years sometimes because of the oppressive conditions. But as one activist explained, the branches were closed, but in practice, our friends were still working as human rights defenders if they weren't in prison. And sometimes even those who were detained in prison were continuing to work from the inside. Under these conditions, where opposition is so brutally suppressed, how does civil resistance engage in the business of exposing state violations and naming state crime? And what impact does that repression have on its activities? Civil activists, those that we interviewed, were engaged in a huge range of state challenging work, from protests and demonstrations to clandestine study groups, weekly sit-ins, occupations, different forms of civil disobedience, information gathering, investigations, documentation, reporting, monitoring state violations, providing medical, legal, and psychological support, reporting the past in order to keep it alive through the creation of memorials, commemorations, art exhibitions, and so on. Through these activities, almost all groups we studied saw one of their key roles as naming state violence and corruption as criminal, as for example, the Turkish Human Rights Association's approach of visiting the scene of a crime, a state crime, in order to keep the public memory alive. The Gayrettepe anti-terror branch of the Istanbul Security Directorate, where many people were tortured and disappeared in the 90s, is one such scene, and activists continue to hang huge posters outside the building and list the names of people who were forcibly disappeared on the posters. They also, as in Argentina, protest at the homes and workplaces of known perpetrators. Organizations developed a range of strategies to subvert state attempts to thwart their activities. In Burma, public transport, in particular buses, formed unlikely but protected places, while in Tunisia, the process of walking and private cars offered safer spaces than buses or trains, on which activists were frequently arrested. For one Tunisian liberty and equity leader and his colleagues, meetings were held and reports drafted in a Renault Clio, as it drove apparently aimlessly around Tunis at night. Burmese tea shops and Tunisian coffee houses and mosques were also frequently places of civil organization, as were the offices of sympathetic lawyers in Turkey and Tunisia. Another tactic deployed was to harness the power of numbers. One Burmese activist would be accompanied by 500 villagers whenever he went on trial. And in the trial of Turkish Seljuk Kızılcılar and others, the Turkish Contemporary Lawyers Association, over 3,500 lawyers petitioned to represent them, and some 850 lawyers attended the first day of the trial. In order to subvert the constant surveillance of phone tapping and threat of arrest, interviewees reported developing codes and metaphors to convey important information between each other. And they changed the meeting venues at the last moment and the times, as well as setting up decoys. More recognized and well-known Muslim leaders in Tunisia, for example, adopted disguises and aliases, so that you had pious Muslim members of the Islamic tendency movement shaving their beards and maintaining a public silence in relation to their beliefs in order to be able to conduct their civic activism. Sometimes the very structure of the organization was designed to avoid detection. The Tunisian Union of Unemployed Graduates organized themselves into cells, and if 4 cells were meeting in the same place, they'd be separated by curtains. Within the cell, members did not know each other's true identities. But the day-to-day practices of resistance and counter-resistance are captured best, I think, by Sinan Tanrıkulu, a Turkish activist. He said, "I would not memorize the places I went to, the addresses, the telephone numbers. I would not use the same route twice whilst walking along the street. I would not always leave the office at the same time, and I would not always go home at the same time. I would change the places where I would be staying at night, and sometimes I would not go home. I would sleep somewhere else." While more repressive political movements in each state demanded underground activities, for the most part, there was, however, a recognition that it's ultimately impossible to succeed in exposing state crime through secret activism alone. Akın Birdal, who I mentioned earlier, said, "We cannot dress in steel from head to toe. We must not be defeated by fear, and we must not give up telling the truth because of fear. Our most powerful weapons are our courage and the fact that we are right." I'll move now very quickly to talk about politics and charity. And we observed an interesting interplay between traditional notions of charity and the development of politicized civil society. Charity may be the original or initial motivation for engaging in civil society activity and later segueing into overtly human rights activism. It may be a cover for more politically related human rights challenges, or it may genuinely engage in both forms of civil life. When in May 2008, 30 young Burmese student activists organized to assist victims of Cyclone Nargis by collecting and burying bodies in the Irrawaddy Delta, they were all arrested and 6 were sentenced to long prison terms for founding an illegal organization and for assisting the 88 generation and for purveying misinformation. Nonetheless, Nargis, which left 130,000 people dead, created an opening for the growth of civil society in Burma in much the same way that responses to the 1999 Marmara earthquake did in Turkey. In Tunisia, Islamic reading groups, social work and fundraising for the poor formed the organizational base for the more political activism which occurred later during the revolution. The Tunisian Women's Association is a clear example of this model, growing out of loosely arranged devotional reading group networks. The TWA now organizes and sees itself as contributing to building a new society through charitable engagement and human rights defense. Of her own Quranic reading group, Ibtihal Abdel Latif made clear that there was no political agenda for us, she said. The police would come and we would have to change houses. Generally, women were scared of politics. I wasn't interested in politics. That was only for rich people. Religion is a duty. Politics is optional. Then I was only interested in religion. But her husband, whose only crime was to attend early morning prayers, was arrested in the 1990s. And as a result, his small business was ruined. And these experiences were transformative for Ibtihal. One of the TWA's chief roles now has been to defend and assist those women who were most oppressed by the former regime. She says, before turning the page of the past, we have to shine a light on it. We have to look to the suffering. Were we as women really living in a paradise under Ben Ali? Charity and religion, Islamic devotion have led to the politicization of Ibtihal Abdul Latif and her charitable foundation. In Burma, the Assistance Association for Political Prisoners in 2000 combined both charitable and political activism. They monitored assistance to political prisoners. They raised funds for those people and for their families. They looked after the health and education and reintegration of former political prisoners. They also saw their role as reporting to the international community on political prisoner issues and the situation that political prisoners were facing in Burma. The Meta Development Foundation, another Burmese NGO, was established in 1998 to formally assist communities in recovering from decades of civil war. And they focused initially on agricultural training. And this was seen as an uncontroversial subject for both the regime and for ceasefire armed groups. The strategy was one of agricultural development, but in fact it acted as a cover. The regime was satisfied that Meta initiatives was purely technology transfer and training, but Meta's real purpose in the end was political, and it embedded facilitation, community mobilization, election and negotiation skills training within sessions on planting and harvesting. Interestingly, in Turkey, by contrast, charity or religious expression was rarely, however, used as a cover for civil opposition. Organizations there were designed explicitly to assist the recovery of torture victims and to deal with the politics which led to torture. THEV was one of the organizations to assist internally displaced Kurds and grew up alongside and worked hand in hand with more politically challenging human rights organizations like İHA'DE, the Turkish Human Rights Association. In fact, in many instances, members of what might be seen as more charitable organizations were also members of the political Human Rights Foundation, a Human Rights Association. And the Muslim Human Rights Association, Mazlum Der, established by activists with a religious sensibility, from its very beginning took on a broad remit driven largely by the persecution of the Kurds and by a recognition that the state was restricting the freedom of religious expression, such as the then prohibition on wearing the headscarf in public institutions, but it was inclusive of all human rights violations. So it was clear to us that under conditions of oppressive governance, the relationship between charity and civil activism is often indistinct. Charities, we have argued, may represent an entree into political activism, a facade for civil organization, or it may be a genuine component of militant civil society. Now, I want to deal with the thorny question of violence. And I think it's increasingly important in the context of Turkey and Burma. In our study, the issue of violence emerged for civil organizations, not only in terms of the violence of the state, but also in relation to the compatibility of violence as a strategy for civil resistance and relationships with armed groups and guerrilla movements. While civil society is universally defined in the academic and NGO literature as a form of non-violent organization, our work revealed that violence does emerge as an ideological and practical issue, particularly for those civil organizations explicitly confronting criminally violent states. We've found that groups challenging repressive states don't always have a simple binary choice between democratic, peaceful, and violent strategies. The concept of civil society must therefore be broad enough to include groups that countenance political violence even if the actual practice of organised violence is by definition not a civil society activity. Violence as a means was only rarely volunteered by our interviewees. When pressed, outright rejection of violence was the most common response. But there were, however, organisations in all three countries where the question of violence had been given serious consideration. One young Burmese activist, Pyo Pyo Ong, said the state is criminal, every department of government is corrupt, and in order to service corruption, they commit violence. Our approach is non-violent. Sometimes, however, violence is needed. I don't do it though. One of the Erdal Kuzul, a member of the Turkish Human Rights Foundation, said similarly, principally, we support democratic, peaceful methods. But if you ask about the 90s, we had no other choice. We did not have any means. In fact, from the 1980s until the 2000s, there wasn't any other way. People were being killed. Villages were evacuated. People were executed. There was nowhere to complain, no authority to try these perpetrators. This was the only solution. But violence, it's meaningless now. The political frustration expressed by some of the activists we interviewed speaks to the need for a conceptual analysis of violence within civil society that acknowledges the contradictions and false binaries between liberal normative frameworks such as human rights and democracy and the strategies required to reveal them. Philip Risk, writing on the 2011 Egyptian revolution, recalls Walter Benjamin's claim that violence, when not endorsed by law, threatens law simply by being exercised outside its domain. That threat, Risk argues, is central to revolutionary success and the necessity, therefore, for civil society to confront and engage with violence when its mission is a revolutionary one. He says, without the burning of police stations on the 28th of January 2011, Egyptian protesters would never have overpowered the state security forces, nor would they have dethroned Mubarak. In Tunisia, one young activist member of the unemployed Graduates Union, Hamza Benan, spoke about civil militantism to capture the role violence played for him in civil activism. He said, if you're going to use violence, the situation has to demand it. But in Tunisia, the style is more inclined to civil struggles, and at most its form is confrontation. Violent clashes, he claimed it was his specialty. You need skills of confrontation as a militant. Civil militantism, when we are required to confront, we do. So here violence represents one end of the spectrum of civil society struggle. It's a particular form of response demanded only in circumstances in which the state acknowledges the strength of its opposition by increasing the violence used to suppress that opposition. In Burma, where the repression was even more extreme, many thousands of young people, frustrated by the lack of change they were capable of bringing during the repression, fled the civil resistance of the streets to take up arms with the border groups in the jungle. During the suppression of the 1988 Burmese uprising, several of our interviewees who'd been students in 1988 reported that deep sense of frustration and depression. One Burmese dissident whose political life began in the Rangoon student movement ended in the border jungles of the rebel guerrillas. For these students, threatening what was widely seen as illegitimate law by a mechanism outside Benjamin's domain of law was the only strategy to topple the military regime. After the military crackdown, this activist said, and thousands of students died, we couldn't do anything. We thought there was no space to do any kind of politics, no space to change anything. So instead, we felt we must fight first and then get democracy. He and his comrades joined thousands of students who'd fled to the jungle on the Thai-Burma southern border to become rebels. There was also evidence of fluidity. A number of those civil activists we interviewed who chose at certain moments to join the armed struggle later returned to engage in non-violent resistance. The other issue which affected many of our respondents was the sheer proximity of armed groups and the coincidence of partially shared goals. In the border regions of Burma and southeast Turkey, civil society invariably connects in varying degrees to armed resistance organizations. Our interviews revealed an often complex and sometimes ambiguous relationship. but time is moving on, and I think I'm probably just going to end now. But I do think it's important to say that violence may be civil society's final frontier. And as our work reveals, it's an uncomfortable but inevitable companion to civil activism under conditions of dictatorship and repression. And it can't be ignored in discussions of civil society's role in resisting the coercive practices of the criminal state. To conclude then, as I noted in the beginning of the talk, civil society isn't a concept to be romanticized. In both Burma and Tunisia, forces of reaction and bigotry were clearly present in civil society, to a degree that brings observers such as ourselves close to despair, most notably racism and Islamophobia in Burma and homophobia in Tunisia. But this shouldn't encourage us to believe, as Habermas has argued, that a robust civil society can develop only in the context of a liberal political culture. As criminologists, we've been particularly interested in one aspect of civil society, namely its role in naming illegitimate state practices criminal and in making visible and resisting state crimes. Accordingly, the concept of civil society we have deployed focuses on those organizations which engage in those activities. Such organizations, as we've seen, may take a wide variety of forms, including charities, religious groups, and those that practice both violent and non-violent resistance. In studying such groups, however, it's impossible to isolate those activities directed specifically against state crime from their wider political and cultural struggles. Thus, the criminological study of state crime and state and civil society merges into a broader interdisciplinary enterprise concerned with violent repression and the manifold forms of struggle against it. Our research revealed that remarkably robust civil societies can exist under the most inauspicious circumstances, drawing political sustenance both from the rationalized cosmopolitan life worlds of human rights and democracy and from indigenous cultural and religious traditions. Inevitably, such civil societies are fraught with contradictions, but they are nonetheless vital to developing and sustaining resistance to authoritarian regimes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Penny. That was super interesting. I'm now going to stop the recording. Oops, no, I'm not.